So I grew up in a large Vietnamese community in San Jose. Tens of thousands of Vietnamese refugees were there in the 1970s and 1980s. And what that meant for me was that I always grew up surrounded by Vietnamese customs, Vietnamese food, Vietnamese language, went to Vietnamese mass every Sunday, had Vietnamese relatives that I would see on a regular basis. And all of that was actually great because it gave me a sense of being Vietnamese. And some of it was not so great because this was a refugee community, like probably all refugee communities, that was saturated by the past. Saturated by loss and longing, all these emotions you would expect that people who feel like they've lost their country are going to experience. So there in the 1970s and 1980s, what was very clear to me was that even though the war that had brought us to this country had ended in 1975 officially, it had never ended for these Vietnamese refugees. There was a lot of anger and bitterness and melancholy. And this manifested itself in terms of a community that was not just celebrating its culture and celebrating its food and its customs and traditions, but was also mourning the loss of South Vietnam continually. So you would go to a Vietnamese community celebration, for example. There would always be veterans dressed up in military uniforms. The national anthem of South Vietnam would play. The flag of South Vietnam would fly. And so that sense that we were still hanging on to this country of South Vietnam and that we would take that country back literally was always there, because there was actually a movement to raise money to send troops back to to Southeast Asia to try to take South Vietnam back. And I grew up with this sense that anti-communism was our way of life. That was our conviction that everybody shared, which meant that we as Vietnamese refugees were totally aligned with the rest of the country in the 1980s up until 1989. And then with the transformations in the world that took place after that, increasingly Vietnamese refugees became out of step with mainstream American politics. And so this was the terrain that I was living in, moving in. It would shape the short stories that I would write in The Refugees. It would shape The Sympathizer, my novel, where I took everything I knew about this community and this lifestyle and I put it into that novel, including this effort to take South Vietnam back that most Americans never even heard of. But I did it with a difference, which is that I wrote The Sympathizer from the perspective of a communist spy, which is completely unacceptable to this Vietnamese refugee community. And so I wanted in my work to acknowledge their pain, to acknowledge their history, but I wanted to do it in a way that would also make them uncomfortable with their own assumptions. And so for me, this is part of the task, the complicated task of a writer. It's not simply to say that because I grew up with these Vietnamese refugees, I was only going to flatter them or cater to them or affirm their worldview. I think the work of a writer is more complicated than that. We can talk about our people, whoever they happen to be, but we can challenge them as well.